Good afternoon. I am Glenn Ruskin, the director of the ACS Office of Public Affairs, and welcome to this news briefing from the 252nd National Meeting and Expo of the American Chemical Society here in beautiful Philadelphia. We're joined today by Dr. Greg Drozd from the University of California at Berkeley, and he will talk to us about his research on auto emissions and what it might mean for the future as regulations to clean up our air tighten even further. So without further ado, Dr. Drozd.
Thanks for the introduction, Glenn. The work I presented this year at the ACS conference was, as Glenn mentioned, about ACS, about emissions from gasoline vehicles and how emissions change in response to the regulations that are imposed by the US EPA as well as the California EPA. So if you could give me the first slide. So the first major result of the work is that VOC emissions from gasoline vehicles have been reduced, and reduced dramatically. So what I'm showing in this figure here is first, this is just a picture of the setup we used. You have a vehicle on what's a treadmill for a car. It's called the dynamometer. We hook up our equipment to the tailpipe and measure the emissions. In this part of the work, I'm focusing on VOCs, but this was a very collaborative work funded again by the California Air Resources Board, led largely by Carnegie Mellon, groups at Carnegie Mellon, Alan Robinson, a group at UC Berkeley with my advisor, Alan Goldstein, and we had also groups at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, UC San Diego, and a private company, Aerodyne Research. So the goal here is to show how drastically emissions have been reduced from gasoline vehicles. And what we can see on this chart is that if we're looking at old vehicles, which are designated as Tier 0, so that's before we had the low emission vehicles program by the US EPA. And you can see this is milligrams and thousands here, so we have a couple grams being emitted by this old vehicle, which is a 1990 model. But a new vehicle, which is designated partial zero emissions vehicle, from 2014 is emitting about 1% of that older vehicle. So total emissions out of cars have been reduced dramatically. And these are the emissions that come over what's called a drive cycle. So one other point I need to make is that we have drastically reduced these vehicle emissions, but still something like 40% of the US population lives in areas where the air is often unhealthy. Recently, for Philadelphia, the number is something like 31 days are unhealthy, particularly to the susceptible population, those with asthma or respiratory ailments, and even some days to everybody. So if we could go to the next slide. Sure. So our study, we were able to measure a very high time resolution, or very frequently, the emissions that were coming out of the tailpipe. Traditional measurements don't measure on this short time scale, so that was an innovation for our work. We also measured a wide range of compounds, but what I'm showing here in this slide is I'm focusing on one compound that is emitted from vehicles largely due to its presence in gasoline fuel, that is benzene. But first I want to direct the attention to the bottom chart, which shows what's this drive cycle. And so that's someone who sits in the car and they drive these speeds here. The top speed is something like 70 miles an hour. And you can see that there's a pattern there. And it's something like your commute to work. You have this first part, which is I'm going to talk about more in a minute, which is called the cold start. And that's when the engine is cold and you just start it up. Then the car is warmed up and you have a hot running emissions. That's just when you're driving around on the highway and stuff. Then to simulate the commute, maybe you stop for coffee. That takes about 10 minutes, so the engine is off. And then you start the car again. That's called a hot start. And we have another opportunity for emissions when you start the car after it's already warm. So for this old vehicle, shown on the top in blue, benzene is coming out frequently, particularly during the cold start, also during the hot start, and in between we see a lot of spikes, particularly when the car accelerates. If we look at the newer vehicle, this PZEV vehicle, which is from 2014, the benzene emissions are almost completely squeezed into that first 30 seconds to 60 seconds of driving. And I want to note that the first 20 seconds of this drive cycle don't involve hitting the gas pedal. That is, the first 20 seconds are just turn the car, you're doing whatever, getting ready to go, and then you drive. So a lot of emissions are actually coming out before we even hit the gas pedal. And you can see a small blip over that really high period of acceleration. But that's after the car is warmed up. That's really the only time we get emissions out of the vehicle. And so one way to think about this is, well, we always have to start the car cold at the beginning of the morning. But how far would we have to drive for the emissions of driving to equal the cold start? And for new vehicles, it's something like 200 miles. The average commuter in the US drives roughly 36 miles a day, so they're never getting to that 200-mile mark. What that means is their emissions, the emissions from their car, the daily commuter, come almost always and completely from that first minute of driving, just mainly when you turn the car on in the morning. And that's because catalytic converters have become extremely efficient at reducing the emissions. So the catalytic converter is what degrades these VOCs into carbon dioxide and some other compounds. So most of our typical commuters' emissions are coming from this cold start, especially if they have a nice new vehicle. And on top of that, we've not only compressed the emissions to that first minute, but we've also reduced the total emissions from most people's driving during the day by 99% relative to roughly 20 years ago. So those are some really interesting findings that we were able to come up with by measuring exhaust from cars on a fairly fast time scale. So with that, I can take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Drozd. That was very interesting. Any questions? If so, please wait for the microphone and then state your name and affiliation.
Dale Bristling, Office of Public Affairs, ACS. Your emissions that you're mostly concerned about are benzene, not or something else too, because obviously it's not all benzene.
That's correct. There's a really wide range of compounds that come out in addition to benzene. I picked benzene here because, one, it's a toxic chemical, so the EPA, US EPA, directly regulates those emissions, but also because it's characteristic of the profile of emissions that come out for almost everything. Other compounds that might come out, say ethane, that's a small gas, or pentane, a slightly larger gas, we can also monitor those with the same equipment. We did so, and we can see that the trend in time with when they come out is almost identical to this benzene compound. Benzene is specifically in the fuel, and some of these other compounds are as well. In addition to that, there are compounds that come out that are partly oxidized. They're mostly burned by the engine. The end result of combustion is to take gasoline and mostly convert it to carbon dioxide. But some compounds end up being only partly on the way to being carbon dioxide. One of those compounds that's emitted is called acetaldehyde. That compound is not in the fuel but comes from combustion, and it also has almost exactly the same time profile as benzene. So benzene was fairly representative of at least when the emissions are coming out.
Of course, lately they've promoted the use of alcohol blends with, and of course acetaldehyde is perfect from coming from ethanol.
Yeah.
So what is your considered opinion? Can we do to reduce emissions of deleterious compounds like benzene? Well, benzene you can leave out. I mean, there are no. Ethanol, on the other hand, is practically a government mandate.
Right.
So you're damned if you are, damned if you're not. So what's your take on all this? What do we do?
Right. So in this study, all vehicles had the same fuel. We use the same fuel because it's good to keep things consistent. And this point, the fuel was 10% ethanol. That's in the state of California. So, and that may have led to those acetaldehyde emissions. And it may, but given that, we still see that the catalytic converter, when hot, is going to nearly eliminate all of those acetaldehyde in general. So in terms of what can we do, Well, the best advice I can give to a driver is, if you have a good car, a new one, just don't hit the gas pedal too hard. And you can't do a lot about the cold start as a driver. You don't want to wait too long to let the car just sit in cold. That if you drive a bit sooner, it may warm up more quickly, so that might help. But in general, the best any driver can do is to just not accelerate really hard. Drive a little less aggressively.
Carrying it further,
Sure.
a different combustion cycle, a gas generator, or even using liquid propane as a fuel, or so would that be causing the same type of problem? I'm sure there's hydrocarbons that go in there in the air on a cold start, but would it be as bad if we went to lighter hydrocarbons?
Sure. We tested a natural gas vehicle, and you see very, very low emissions coming out of those vehicles. And so those are going to be cleaner in terms of these VOCs. And one other thing I want to really make clear is that I'm talking about VOCs, which are important for controlling ozone as well as small particulate matter. That's PM 2.5 is what's regulated. And so these emissions are being reduced in terms of things that harm our health. But carbon dioxide is always being produced in these. We have combustion, so this isn't really as much about climate effects as it is about health effects for this particular work.
Thank you.
You have a question online?
Yeah, we have an online question from Christine Suh, Office of Public Affairs. So how many total compounds did you detect in the emissions? And did you find any compounds that you weren't expecting to see or that hadn't been previously reported?
We detected a wide range of compounds. The equipment we use is called a mass spectrometer, and it's able to measure the actual number of compounds we detected is very high, hundreds, but the ones we can actually identify is more in the range of 30 or so. Some of the compounds that that aren't known to be, I should say, aren't typically measured is something like acetonitrile. We were able to observe that in high time resolution, which has rarely been done in the past. It's been observed, but not in the way that we observed it.
And a question from me. So what steps are car manufacturers doing to reduce emissions from a cold start, or are they not really concerned with that cold start?
Well, to meet the regulations, I think they're pretty concerned with the cold start. In terms of car manufacturers, the car manufacturers, they're going to be doing a lot to reduce emissions by optimizing how the engine runs. So when the engine runs during different times, say during a cold start or when you need to accelerate a lot, the engine runs rich in fuel. What that means is it gets a little bit more fuel than it normally would when it's operating otherwise and during the sort of optimal conditions. And when you give the engine extra fuel, that means that more of that fuel is likely to pass out the tailpipe. The two times when we call this running rich are particularly during cold starts and acceleration.
Okay. That looks like, yes,
Sorry.
go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, to finish answering that question, that's what the car manufacturers are doing. But we also have those who are manufacturing catalytic converters. And so those companies, one's actually just not too far out of Philadelphia, Johnson Matthey, they're doing things to improve how the catalyst works. This is a combination of precious metals like platinum or other things like that they can optimize how efficiently that works. The other thing they can do is try to make the catalytic converter get hot sooner. In general, the catalytic converter is just heated by the exhaust from the car. There are other ways to do that. You can electrically heat it, but there are some engineering difficulties that lead to that not having been, in mass production at this point. So that's what car manufacturers as well as catalytic converter manufacturers are doing to reduce emissions from vehicles.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Drozd, and thank you for those here in Philadelphia and those online. The archive version of this session will soon be posted at bit.ly ACS Live Philadelphia. So please join us for our next press conference Tuesday, August 23rd at 9 a.m., and it will be focused on improving the taste of foods in low in fat, sugar, and salt. Thank you all very much.